oath taking was very significant for the early Christians. So one of the most compelling reasons that I found to really take the Sermon on the Mount seriously was to study the first 300 years of Christianity and how they were interacting with Jesus' teachings. And they took it way more seriously than we did and had a much higher cost as well. So a lot of blood in the early Christian witness surrounding the refusal around oaths. So I think at least paying attention to why they were doing that is really important to us in our day and age.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining the Living Anabaptism podcast. Today I'm talking with Zack Johnson. Zack currently serves as president of Sattler College in East Boston. He was born and raised in Quito, Ecuador, and has a passion for Christianity and global engagement. He previously worked as a congressional analyst for the U.S. Air Force before being honorably discharged as a conscientious objector. He now focuses on peacemaking and global poverty solutions. Zack and I talk about why Christians shouldn't take oaths, his personal experience with them, and the importance of the words that we use in general. I hope you find some encouragement as you join me in learning from Zack.
Zach, thank you so much for joining us on the Living Anabaptism podcast. You're the president at Sattler College. Could you kind of share a little bit about what you do there and what the college is as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I always make a joke that the president is somebody who should be the janitor as well as making a lot of decisions at top. But I was actually one of the first employees at Sattler. So we started in 2018, and I worked at Sattler before we had a bank account, and then now serve as the president. And I also teach a few classes here and there. So we have an administrative faculty model, and I work with the board to carry out the mission. And I think that's just in general the job of the president. But I did can I throw in a little bit of trivia about the word president?
Oh, go ahead.
If I'm allowed to. So right outside my window, I wish you could see it. I know I'm not allowed to film in front of windows, but you can actually look over Harvard's campus. And a lot of people don't know this, but Harvard had a president named George Dunster, and he was one of Harvard's first presidents. And they came to him and he said, "Hey, would you lead Harvard?" And at that time, the top position at any institution was a master. And he said, "You know what? I'll take the position as long as you're allowed to call it president," which is somebody that just presides over an institution. So it was actually a term of humility originally. And then the United States and the world took Dunster's lead on that term. So I always like to explain it's somebody who presides over something, but it's not supposed to be. I think it's kind of converted into this kind of like lofty, I'm in charge of everything type thinking. But yeah, I preside over Sattler.
Oh, okay. That's really cool. What do you Sattler, I guess, Sattler as a college, what's your mission, or what do you guys do there?
Yeah, so our mission statement flows from the greatest commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so we provide an education that equips students to do that. And we operate basically off a 3C model guided by 3 principles. So a robust core curriculum. We're very intentional about the classes we select. And one way of thinking about it, we're the only college in the world that still requires all students to take Greek and Hebrew, regardless of your major. So we have people training to be doctors, computer scientists, businessmen, historians, and then we also have a biblical and religious studies degree. But everyone takes a robust core curriculum, which is very unique. So that's sort of the first one. And then we do a lot of character development as well. So we put all our students through a discipleship program. Similar, I bet, to I visited Rosedale there, and I think we have some commonalities in the way that we think about discipleship. So we basically try to do really intense and rigorous academics, couple it with character development, and then the cost piece is our third C. We actually have now launched a model where every student gets a fully funded offer to attend the college in exchange for some commitment to Christian service on the tail end. And those are sort of our distinctives. We're right in the heart of Boston, which is very unique about us. We're very intentional about being sort of where the locus of education is. So it's a great place to come and study.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like such a unique and cool blend of all sorts of different opportunities. Can I ask a little bit, how does the cost element work? How do you manage to offer that type of tuition?
Yeah, it's very. I actually think a lot of small liberal arts institutions should be paying attention to this, because especially in New England, the traditional model where students enter into a contract with an institution, you might be familiar. You get a bill for tuition, and then you pay, and then you sort of end the relationship. What we looked at was raising enough money to give every single student, not have to charge them tuition. And then on the back end, we're saying to our alumni, hey, we raised all this money to make it possible for you. Over the course of your life, could you give it forward to us more in relationship, given that the institution produced something that you're proud of? And so we're actually banking on doing that initial round of fundraising, which we did, and then the future alumni actually making it feasible and sustainable moving forward.
Gotcha. That sounds like such a cool, yeah, practice movement.
Yeah, it keeps us honest too, because it keeps us honest because I have to do something that the community supports, right? If because you can kind of actually get into some tricky situations where you drift and you create something that wasn't the intent of the institution. Anyway, I could talk about that for a long time.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, and that totally makes sense. The kind of, yeah, honesty, accountability there. You have to not necessarily a product, but you have to give an experience that people believe in. So yeah, that's really cool. So today we're talking about taking oaths, swearing oaths. I wanted to just kind of dive right in the deep end. We're in a series on two kingdom theology, how the church and government should interact. And so I wanted to just kind of ask the question, why is the conversation about oaths? Why does it matter to this conversation? How does it kind of fit in with all that?
Yeah, so in terms of two kingdoms theology, I would even a synonym I would use for that is sort of Sermon on the Mount Christianity. I know that there's a lot of different things that you could call it, but when I think of two kingdoms and the framework for that, I think it's almost a sin not to reference the Sermon on the Mount as one of the key documents to understand the two kingdoms theology. When I'll tell a story, I was in the military for 7 years. I was in the Air Force, and I left as a conscientious objector, and so I had to had something called a CO trial where there was a military lawyer or a JAG who called all of these witnesses to the stand about why I should not be able to serve in the military because I had a long commitment afterwards. And he asked one of the brothers in my church, like, can you explain this two kingdoms thing to me a little bit? And this moment has really stuck with me. He said, yeah, let me lay it out for you. So the word Christ, a lot of people don't know this, but a good replacement for that word is king. And some people forget that Christ is the title. So the word Christ is king. We have a king, and each king usually has two things about them: a set of rules or laws, and the people. So in the two kingdoms framework, Christ is king. The Sermon on the Mount in particular, I use the analogy as a constitution, sort of the way to understand the king. And then the people are the church. So the rules, and the kingdom are the church. And then so pivotally, if the Sermon on the Mount is that constitution and oaths culminate in a set of Jesus's teachings on how to understand how he wants us to live, it's tremendously important to study everything in the Sermon on the Mount, but how oaths make their way in there is very important. And then we know, especially further on, we can talk about scripture, but a lot of people have commented that the book of James is really a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. If you go and read the Sermon on the Mount and then study James, you'll start to see what I'm talking about. But then James reiterates this, and he gives all these lofty teachings that at the end he says, above all, my brethren, do not swear neither by heaven or by earth. So somehow the half brother of Jesus elevates oath taking to be above all thing that we should be paying attention to. And I just don't think that dialogue has happened in a lot of the sphere of Christianity today. So that's why I think it's so important to make its way in. And then I'll even go on a little bit more of a tangent. Oath taking was very significant for the early Christians. So one of the most compelling reasons that I found to really take the Sermon on the Mount seriously was to study the first 300 years of Christianity and how they were interacting with Jesus' teachings. And they took it way more seriously than we did, and had a much higher cost as well. So a lot of blood in the early Christian witness surrounding the refusal around oaths. So I think at least paying attention to why they were doing that is really important to us in our day and age.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's a really helpful way of framing it. Like it's right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, which is kind of our Constitution. So I like that language. A quick little side note that I'm really curious about, and maybe some listeners are also curious about. You were talking about the early church. Are there places that I can go or viewers can go to kind of read more about, the early church, the first few hundred years?
I'll point you to a few resources. My favorite like handy book. There's something called the Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs, and it was written by a guy named David Berceau, who his testimony is he was actually from the Jehovah's Witness Church, and he read through something called the Ante-Nicene Fathers. So ante-Nicene, so pre-Council of Nicaea. It's around 326, and he basically collated as many of those Christian teachings and condensed them into an index, so that if you want to like look for a topic on what did the early Christians believe about this topic, you can kind of quickly leaf through some of these like quick quotes. So if you wanted to like research oaths, you could do that, or nonviolence, etc. So that's a really good place to start. I'll even mention a book called Caesar and the Lamb that was written by a guy named George Kalantzis, and Kalantzis runs something called the Center for Early Christianity out in Wheaton College. And he's a native Greek speaker who has also interacted really intensely with those ante-Nicene writings. And somewhere in those resources, you can find the footnotes and things like that. And there's a couple of more semantic searches online that are getting a little bit more popular with like the advent of AI, where you can ask these models like what the early Christians believed about this topic. But that dictionary of early Christian beliefs is a really good place to start, or Caesar and the Lamb, I would say, is like a good like intro. But there are tons of resources out there. Those are the two of my favorites.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. I'll have to look into that because that's, something I hear a lot of people talking about the early church, and it's so fascinating. And I think it's helpful to know how, some of the people that were closest to the time of Jesus, how they interpreted his teachings. So I'm sure viewers will also really appreciate that. So kind of moving on into like, what is it about oaths, or like, what does scripture say about oaths? So obviously in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, Jesus talks about oaths. Why does he pick oaths, and what is it that he says about oaths? Like, it seems like he kind of talks about them negatively. Like, why does he see them as bad?
So this is where I can take a stab at the question. I'll just go on to say that Jesus never tells us the exact why, other than maybe I can just read the scriptures here because I have them in front of me, if that's okay. And then I can sort of give my two-pronged answer to why I think why I think Jesus was labeling us as bad. But I think this is an open question that we don't get to ask a lot of whys, and there's a little bit of a mystery to it as well. So I'll just preface it with that. So Matthew 5:33 through 37 says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you should not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one." So I think that's the key text really to think about here in this. But then in James, you fast forward, James 5:12 says, "But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment." So James actually James somehow warns us that the reason not to swear is to not fall into judgment, but then you have to like dig a little bit deeper into what that judgment could be. So I'll give my two-pronged answer just right off the bat, and maybe you can ask me some more questions. So the first obvious reason not to take oaths is Jesus is warning about sort of consistency and truthfulness, and that somehow in the culture of the day, when there was some sort of operating standard, that you couldn't trust people to be honest. And so you kind of can think about this in terms of some of the Old Testament language, when in markets people would have to weigh their whatever you're buying against a weight. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah.
And so you would have to buy that weight, and that weight could be the way to get around it was to buy a lighter weight and to say you're selling more. And so we know that, at least from the Old Testament language, that this is what people are putting oaths on, and like, I swear that this is the right weight, and you kind of have to trust that. So in the Sermon on the Mount, you see Jesus sort of delineate these levels of where people were trying to get people to trust them based on what you swear on. So, and you can see it sort of go from the top to the bottom there when he's warning what not to swear by. So he's saying, don't swear by heaven, for is God's throne. And you could imagine if someone really wanted someone to believe them, you'd swear by heaven, right? Like, I swear by heaven, like this is the ultimate. But I won't go through all of them. Let's say that it's just like you kind of want someone to trust you. You say like, I swear by my own head, which isn't as significant. But I think that's number one, is just that Jesus is re-elevating the importance of our words, and that words really matter in God's economy. When you think back about some of these stories in the Old Testament, I always think about uh, sort of Jacob and Esau, and when they're trying to get the blessing, and you see Esau just be crushed because his father gave this blessing before him, and you're like, why does that even matter? Like, why is this such a crushing moment in Esau's life? And that has to do with blessings too, but words are really important. And what Jesus is warning about is playing into this game where you get to be honest in some scenarios, and then you actually have to like elevate your words to be truthful when you take an oath, but when you're outside of that, you're not. So that, I think that's like the obvious place to start, right? Does that line of
Yeah.
thinking make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, yeah, oaths are just kind of a replacement for truthfulness and some essence, I guess.
Yeah, and you can actually look at that. I'm assuming that most of the audience is probably a US based audience. That now, when you read across and watch some of the current events and news, like, one of the sin of sins is to lie under oath. It's really interesting. It's like, oh, you lied under oath, and then they shake you, but somehow somehow that's not as bad as if you lied not under oath, in the way that people think about it. So I think Jesus is really warning against that. That he's trying to get us to think, no, we have to be constant in the way that we say speak the truth always. And oaths, in a way, is the world's substitute to truthfulness. It's like we're trying to get people to be honest, and so they incorporate these oaths into their systems. You find them all over, and Jesus is saying, no, there's another way. It's simple. It's let your yes be yes and your no no, always, no matter what, in every circumstance.
Is it kinda like oaths are like flipping a switch or something where it's like, "Okay, now that I swore this oath, now I'll be truthful." But then, like, I'm not under oath now, so I can, kind of twist my words and lie a little bit, and Jesus is kind of saying, like, "No, we shouldn't do that, we should just always be truthful." Like, there's no switch for when we can be truthful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a good way to think about it. That well, and in all reality, that switch, it doesn't make any sense to me. That when you really take a step back, and you're like, wait a second, why do we even have to ask to be told the truth? Like, that should be the standard. If you've been in court, which I've been in a few trials right before, especially in my own, they ask you, will you tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And why are we having to ask people that? So the world is having to sort of create this false standard, or its own standard, as opposed to this Christian standard, which is we're always telling the truth. So I like the light switch too. It's a good way to think about it. And then the second run, I think, uh, ties a little bit back into the original point of like the two kingdoms lifestyle. And this is where I think Jesus foresaw a lot more than we give him credit for. And oath taking is also now a form of sort of unfettered allegiance to a set of ideas that a lot of people are called into now. And so the first thing I would say is bad is, you're not allowed to pass ever not to be honest. The second is, you really have to watch what you give your allegiance to outside of the teachings of Jesus. And I would say that that's actually the category of things that has been most meaningful to me. That there's a lot of different people that say, I want you to commit to this document and pledge yourself to it no matter what. And Jesus is actually warning against that. He said, what I think is like, no, your allegiance is to me first and foremost. And you shouldn't have, as a Christian, especially a follower of Christ, I'll frame it that way. You shouldn't be taking any form of bending your knee to something that is outside of the perfection of Christ. And that's actually where I think is another, what has been more significant for me in sort of how I think about oaths, is asking the question, who has our allegiance, and is it Christ or is it something else? And I think that a lot of sort of, I'll call it mainstream Christianity, don't really think about it, and you're sort of allowed to have two masters. You can have Jesus as a master in one context and something else as a master in another context. And often the two, they just don't go well together when you really look at the fine print.
So there's the element of always being truthful, but then also kind of protecting ourselves from multiple allegiances. Is that a good way of phrasing it, or is there a better way?
Yeah, that's what I'd say. Just not bending your knee. I mean, taking an oath, I would say, is like one of the biggest, like, I'm going to bow to this and bend the knee and call it my master type moments that you get in life, and trying to avoid, and really not trying to avoid them. If you've chosen Christ as your master, let him be your master. Or Lord's a good way to think about it.
So there are times then in, especially like, American life, there are different government rules. I know I haven't been myself faced specifically with any like oaths that I have to swear. But if there are times when we are, um, find ourselves asked to take an oath, what should we as Christians do instead of that?
Yeah. So I think maybe I was ready to give, a little bit of a definition of an oath so that I can kind of train people to think, what's an oath, what's not an oath. And I think it's important to, one of the points I always make is that somehow oaths are in a different category than vows, promises, contracts, and covenants. So, but there are similarities to them. And so I just wanted to start this by saying that I don't think we should take oaths, but we can say marriage vows to people. We can make promises. We can enter into contracts, and we can enter into covenants with people. But oaths are in their own category, so it's useful to kind of think about what are the main elements of an oath. The three prongs of an oath that I found most helpful are, and there's different way to say it, but some form of attestation to a truth or a commitment. And then the second one is invoking a higher entity. And then the third is inviting punishment into your life if you somehow break the original, like, attestation of truth or promise. A quick example so that people have their minds wrapped around it. A good example would be like the presidential oath. A lot of us are familiar that a presidential election just happened in the country, and so come January, um, this is the oath that President Trump will say at that time. He'll say, "I solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States." And then somebody in the audience will ask them, "So help you God?" And then the president will respond with, "So help me God." And I think this is like oath taking 101 here. There's this statement that's going to be read, and this person is going to do this in front of a group of people. And I forgot to say that he'll have his left hand on the Bible, if you haven't seen that before. So in a way, there's a statement of attestation, and then the invocation of a transcendent being here happens in a couple ways, but the Bible represents God. He's doing this with his left hand on the Bible. And then that question at the end also kind of ties into that. "So help you God." And it doubles as like, if I don't do this, the president is saying, I invite God's judgment into my life. And when you think about that, that's a really intense thing that you're doing, that I don't think a lot of people really take a step back and say, do I really want to invite God's judgment into my life if I don't fulfill a really high duty of office? So that's like a really intense oath that I think not a lot of us will encounter in our lives. But I think those are sort of the elements you want to really pay attention to. And your original question was like, what do we do when we encounter oaths, and how should we go about taking them? So with that definition, I wanted to just say that there's a few different places some of us, your average person, will encounter oaths. One is jury duty. You're also asked to sort of take some oaths of truth telling, and if you're ever called into a witness of court, and there's actually really straightforward ways where we can actually participate in some of this. So if I were ever to be called in as like a witness, you can actually negotiate with the lawyer, the judge, whatever the case is, and say, hey, rather than ask me, do you swear to tell the truth, the truth, or so help me God, you can just frame it and say, hey, can you just ask me, will you be truthful? And I can say yes. So there's actually really simple ways around some of the swearing language. If any of you are ever purchasing homes or doing any legal documents, I've made it a habit that whenever I see the word swear, they'll let you do this. You just cross it out and you can say, I'll tell the truth. And it's actually really good training to start to look for this language all over like what the fabric of our society. But then if you ever get into the loftier oaths that include all three of those elements, my general plea to everybody is that you really have to examine the content of what you're agreeing to in in order to, I would say, evaluate if you can take the next step. So let's just say that you're considering taking an oath to the police force, or, and this is going to show where I fall on some of this, or maybe some fireman's oaths or something like this, that you're actually able now to say, rather than I swear, you can cross out swear and say, I affirm that I will do this. And then now legally they've taken out the so help me God at the end, kind of invoking that transcendent entity. And I would just say, if you're ever in that scenario, you should be really, really, really quick, or not quick, diligent to examine what you're saying yes to. And if you can't say yes to it, then say no to it. Um, that's the easiest way to communicate that. But if you're ever given a statement to say, I will do this, and you read it, and in my case, the oath of the military, or the oath of commissioning for officers, is to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that you do this with no reservation or purpose of evasion. So when I look at that now, I look at that and say, hey, a ton of people who have allegiance to Christ should look at that statement and say, I can't say yes to this because I actually don't know what the future holds there. So I think it depends on the oath in itself and what you're engaging with. But sort of the quick, like takeaways are: one, don't like avoid using the word swear, like swearing language, because that's actually getting into oath territory. And then two, really evaluating the things you say yes to and no to against, I would say, just the totality of the New Testament. And if you can even smell a compromise, you got to say no to it. In my humble, but I hold that opinion very convictional.
That makes a lot of sense. So there was the three parts of the oath that you were talking about: the attestation to truth, invoking a higher power, and then some form of punishment if you don't follow through. Right? Those are the three things. So the the first one doesn't necessarily seem like it's dangerous in any capacity, but it seems like it's kind of the other two elements that when you add those onto the attestation of truth, that it kind of starts to become dangerous. Is that a correct understanding of that?
Yeah, I would affirm that, but I think the caveat I was trying to say, that you still have to read through the attestation of truth. And so what I'm trying to get at there is, this was actually made famous by the Quakers. So the Quakers, their way around taking oaths to the government was to say, I affirm that I will do this, and then they crossed out that so help me God at the end. And I would say that that's a good start, but you can't commit to saying yes to something that you have convictions against. So you still have to look at what you're saying yes to. And just because the Quakers took out the swearing language and the so help me God, I still think that the Sermon on the Mount convictions prohibit you from saying yes to that language in itself. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not just the form of the way that we're committing to
Right.
something, so the substance of what we're committing to.
That's exactly right. And but then, like, if you're ever like seeing the three together, I think that's really where your Holy Spirit goosebumps should be going off on, hey, is this an oath, or am I is this something that Jesus is warning me against, and things like that.
That makes a lot of sense. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit. You've taken an oath at one point in your life. And I know you were at RBC one time and you kind of shared your story there. I thought it might be helpful for people who haven't heard you talk about it to kind of give a little bit of your story and explain your personal experience with taking oaths and how your mind kind of changed and yeah, how you came to understand it. So would you be willing to kind of share that?
Yeah, that's like that's an easy question. No, I hopefully I don't bore the audience here, but so I was a missionary kid, so I was a dual citizen. I have a Ecuadorian passport, right, and an American passport. And the first time I ever took an oath was actually at my high school graduation. And so, in order to get a diploma in Ecuador, they have a ceremony called the. It's almost like a pledge of allegiance to the flag, but in Spanish for Spanish speakers, it's called juramento a la bandera, which is basically like you're pledging yourself to like patriotism. And so in this ceremony, your senior year, a member of your class, they select the top Ecuadorian performer in the class to hold the Ecuadorian flag, and one by one, each Ecuadorian citizen has to get down on one knee, hold the flag in their hand, kiss it, and say "Si juro," which means "I swear." And there's actually a military procession behind them, and they do this one by one by every single person in order to receive your diploma. Ironically, I was actually the person holding the Ecuadorian flag, which goes to show that it's really ironic. So I did that. I All my classmates went through, and then I walked through, and then I got down on the knee and I screamed, "I swear," as loudly as I could, and everyone clapped. It's in front of parents and families and things like that. And what's ironic to me is I didn't even really think about it. It was just like sort of pomp and circumstance, a lot of ceremony. I never even like mapped out a spiritual reality to the words I was saying until much later on when somebody was like, "Hey, what is this oath thing that Jesus was talking?" So that's number one. And then fast forward, this is where I just think it's hilarious. Fast forward in my life, 6 months later, just after I had sworn my allegiance to the Ecuadorian flag, I joined the U.S. Air Force, and I took an oath of commissioning to as a cadet to become a military officer. So they put cadets on active duty. And 6 months later, I basically threw that other oath away and switched my allegiance over to the US. And I actually had to renounce my citizenship to Ecuador. So they sort of have this legal document and things like that. And they parade through 1,000 of the cadets at a time. You raise your right hand and you say an oath, which has all three elements, by the way, of what I mentioned there: the swearing, the statement, and then the "So help me God." And I still remember like 1,000 people saying "So help me God," like right in front of. I went to a place called the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. So you're saying this right below this like really intense chapel that kind of looks like a fighter jet. It's very iconic. In case I'm sure some people can picture it if they've ever been to Colorado Springs. And then 4 years later, or 5 years later in my case, I took an oath of commissioning to become an officer, where you take every single officer in the Army takes that oath. So those are the three moments in my life where I definitely was engaging in sort of that three-pronged, by my definition, full oath-taking mode. And then I could talk about my story really for a long time. When I was later on in the Air Force, I started really questioning if I wanted to kill in the name of X, Y, or Z in terms of like the political structure of the country. And I really started taking the Bible pretty seriously. And I was trying to figure out like, what does the Bible mean in my context? I was a place called the Air Force sent me to go study at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, which I got a sweet deal and was able to sort of pause and study under some people that like led the war efforts, especially in Iraq, Afghanistan. And I was just really puzzled because in my frame of view, I was really serving, like doing a God and country, uh, kind of had a God and country mindset. That was a huge part of who I was. And when I became convinced that I couldn't use violence as a Christian, that when Jesus taught, "Love your enemies as yourself," I went to my commander and I said, "Hey, I'm wrestling with this. I don't think that I can use violence." And they said, and this is kind of fast forwarding the story a lot, but the system in itself said, "Hey, no problem. We will create a non-combatant status for you. in the military and in the government, and you can just work your way through, and it won't be an issue. However, what what I couldn't do was not take oaths every time I promoted in rank. And so the idea of being a non-combatant is possible, but the idea of not taking the commissioning oath is not possible. So in my story, I probably would have stayed in the military and served out had the oath not been a part of the system in its entirety, and my sort of just understanding of the Sermon on the Mount there. And so the oath was like the make or break for me as to whether I was going to stay in the Air Force, or if I was going to sort of try to apply as a conscientious objector. And it was a super significant moment because they told me if I did leave that I was going to owe $500,000 back to the government. So I didn't make that decision lightly at all, but it was sort of the final indication for me that the Sermon on the Mount was incompatible with the military lifestyle.
I feel like, at least in my life, like it's been more obvious, and I've been quicker to adopt the nonviolence standpoint, and the oath taking doesn't. Maybe it's because it doesn't feel as like radical, or I don't know why, but it doesn't. That doesn't necessarily come along with it as readily in my mind. So like, what made taking oaths like? What made you like really firm on that during this time? Because I mean, that's obviously such a huge mental shift, and a big price to pay too. So like, what kind of evidence was there to really like convince you otherwise?
Well, I think this just draws. I'll just draw it back to what I was saying before, that when you looked at the words that they were wanting me to say consistently to promote, you sort of take this, or the expectation is you're committing to this. You say, I, full name, having been appointed a rank in mine was the Air Force, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so basically what I saw there was I started on nonviolence, and like peacemaking was really what attracted me to Jesus's teachings. But the the idea of saying like I can't be violent, but then I'll say that I'll protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies in whatever circumstances, they just don't go together. And so for me, it was sort of a moment of either I'm going to be a hypocrite and either I'm going to be a hypocrite or I'm going to refuse the oath, because I just can't say that I'll do that for the Constitution. I'm not saying, I hope you don't, I know that I'm not saying anything negative about the Constitution. I think it's a really impressive document, but for Christians, we can't like give ourselves to that. And I think really what it's saying is, hey, I'll do anything to protect this, even if the government tells me to go whack people. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And I think this is probably relevant to my own story as well. But one of the whole convincing arguments for me for why enemy love is so important was just the trail of thought is, can there ever be a scenario where one Christian in one country goes to war against a Christian in another country, and they come together and they like are killing each other? Is that I don't know. Have you ever thought about that? Is that okay?
Yeah, no, is it C.S. Lewis who wrote about that at one point? Or I feel like I've read something about that. They talked about like, they'll like shoot each other and then they'll laugh about it in heaven or something. And I was like, that doesn't, I don't know that that really works. Like it doesn't, it feels like there's a conflict if it's two Christians fighting against each other.
That's right. That's right. And just logic for me kind of really um, made the whole like allegiance to a specific nation very unappealing once you start thinking in terms of two kingdoms, where there's the kingdom of God and Christ, and that's your kingdom, and the kingdoms of the world sort of belong to this other domain. And so that level of thinking really made it appealing to me, that say, hey, I can't be in a place where I could ever go and kill another Christian. People, a lot of my friends in the military, they're great guys. I still have a lot of respect for them, and that they kind of think to themselves that like that never happens. Like no Christians are actually ever killing other Christians. But then I think even today when we think about it, when you look at like the war in Ukraine and Russia, for example, is a good example. a lot of those soldiers on both sides would be professing Christians in some way, shape, or form, even though it's maybe a different expression of the faith. And you got to just look at that and say, man, there's no way that Christ was intending for his followers to give their whatever their allegiance to these two different systems, and then just because their governments are at odds with each other, that means that they're now at odds with each other. And just that whole line of thinking, I think, was really compelling for me to follow the prohibition against oaths and just at whatever the cost, even though if it would cost money and yada yada yada. Today, I know this is funny, but the greatest cost to me for oath taking now is when I have to get a parking sticker in the city of Boston, and there's this. I'm trying to get them to change it online. It says like, I swear that this is true, and I always have to mail in the form. Be like, can I just say that this is true rather than swearing? And it takes an extra month. But I'm still very obsessed with like not compromising anywhere on it, even in being kind of like above reproach in the way that we think about oaths.
It feels like I'm not trying to like talk against you in any way, but it
No, no, no,
almost
no.
like sometimes it feels a little silly to like. Is it really to the point where we have to avoid swearing? Like, I uh, I appreciate the conviction, but I just wonder like some people might be like, is that really what like we're called to do is follow like the specific letter, like, oh, this word is here, so we have to avoid it.
That's where I'll reiterate that the swearing that something's true doesn't bother me as much, but I just love to train myself to treat the New Testament as literal wherever I can. And that passage in James, it just says, just having that in the running through the back of my mind, do not swear at all. And maybe m- maybe that it's morphed over time and our culture isn't what James is talking about. Maybe I'll just even say that, but I generally don't think that people weigh their words enough. Um, and I believe that Jesus and James is calling us to be precise people who don't do anything unintentionally. And I really think it could be silly, but I think that the counterpoint is, man, I think we're too loose with our words, and we know that we know that what we say matters, and sometimes that people don't treat their words as actions, but they really are. Our words are really significant, and James talks a lot more about this as like the tongue is what sets was it sets things on fire. And so I do think that we have to watch our words and our actions more than we currently do on average. And so for me, it might be silly, but it's a way for me to really be familiar with the New Testament and never be in like this ambiguous zone where it's like, I'm not sure, I'm just going to do it anyway. I know, yeah, it could be silly, but
Yeah, I just think, there might be some people who are like, "Ah, this is seems a little, far-fetched," but I do really appreciate the commitment to it. You're talking about maybe we don't weigh our words enough. I know this is maybe getting a little bit in a different direction, but I think that's like a really interesting point. Do you wanna maybe talk a little bit more about that? Like, what might it look like for us as Christians to think about the words we say more, or what are areas where we need to spend more time thinking about them?
yeah, I think I mean, this can be applicable everywhere. And the in James it says everybody should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And when I think about somebody who is very wise in my life, I'll give I'll give an example of my father-in-law, who before speaking, that man will sit there and think. And I think that it might be some of the German blood in him, and just think really hard about what he's going to say rather than be really instantly like just yapping to sort of prove a point. And I think that I don't know what generation you are. What generation are you?
I think I'm considered Gen Z.
Yeah, you're Gen Z. I think I'm millennial, I think still. I have to double check myself. But I think there is a little bit of a letting down our guards with like the words we spew. And that might having be something to do with social media or just context. But I think there is a wisdom in learning how to be silent and listen much more than we're talking. And so in general, I think there's just wisdom in itself and being being slow to what did I say? Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But then on the tail end of it, on the sort of more other side, like just really weighing your commitments against your beliefs is something I think requires more intentionality that and maybe some people do this very intentionally. I definitely didn't. So I'm preaching to the historic self where I didn't have a complete understanding of what to weigh my commitments against. And that's really what I think we should be doing is, hey, what do I stand for? And each of my decisions, I should have a way to filter those against a set of beliefs and values. And with our words, I think that's equally that's equally important. And I even think this goes into our current political climate. Even this idea of using our words to attack people, you see it constantly around us right now. And I think that it's a really big tragedy that there's this whole like culture war thing going on, and people are attacking each other, and rather than engaging with the ideas. And this is where I see like this tying with enemy love, that our words should be a reflection of our love of enemies. And so even like down the lines of gossip and things like that, man, the tongue can set some incredible fires. So I think all of us could just use some more weighing of our words before we just ramble, before we make commitments, and then especially before we speak negatively about another human, even if we disagree with them vehemently. I think we can do that in a loving, convictional way without kind of engaging in the sort of the slander gossip culture.
That's really, really powerful, and I think something that you're right, that's we don't think about that a lot, and it's not, like, something that, at least in my life, hasn't been something brought up too much to even think about the fact that my words matter and I should think about them more, but, yeah, I think it's really important.
So says the two guys rambling on a podcast, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I need to learn how to do this better. I start asking questions sometimes and still try to figure out where I'm going as I'm, saying them. But, kind of speaking along the lines of weighing what we say and obviously oath taking, one of the last kinda topics, questions I wanted to ask about was the Pledge of Allegiance. And I know this is something personally in my life, I grew up going to public school, so I said the Pledge of Allegiance before each day of class, and it wasn't something I ever really thought about. So I think it ties right into weighing our words. Do you have thoughts on how we should look at the Pledge of Allegiance? Is that something you would want to get into or not?
I'll call myself a non-expert on the Pledge of Allegiance because I spent 18 years in Ecuador. I'm very familiar with the idea. So when you look at the evolution of it, I read a Wikipedia article about it before the podcast just so I can I was anticipating the question in itself. But the original language was, I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all. N- I still think my personal opinion on that is, man, there's actually a way to be respectful without engaging directly. And so you could actually be someone who protests the Pledge of Allegiance. So there's been a history of that in even the conservative Anabaptist circles that would got permission to kind of like sit down throughout it. But if I was in just making a decision and trying to train my own kids, I would avoid the language of pledging allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible with liberty under all. Like when I look at that language, I think it gets dangerously close to this whole like inviting another master into your life. And I'll just use the line that when Jesus was talking about taxes, he uses this brilliant line like, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God's what is God." And I just believe wholeheartedly that Caesar does not deserve our allegiance. In terms of this language, God deserves that allegiance. But what the nation does deserve is our prayers, our service, our our continuing applying Jesus's teachings throughout our immediate context. So that's kind of how I think about it, is in terms of like utter allegiance. I think we can only give that to God, and the way it's written to me makes it makes me me cringe a little bit, and especially in two kingdoms theology, when you look at when you look at how it's evolved. Now, I think the current version says, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." And so that current wording, I think, is like, we could get into this in another podcast, is a direct in conflict with two kingdoms there and how we think about the two kingdoms. So I would personally not say the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd probably might stand and just maybe smile at people as they do it, but not verbalize it. And if you're really convictional about it, I would actually support just sort of the, I'm just going to sit down while you guys do this type of thing.
What was it about that wording that you think is specifically in contrast with the two kingdoms theology?
The one nation under God. So when you really start to tease out, like, this is my theology and what I believe is going to reveal itself here, but I think at the essence of two kingdoms, you believe that Christ has a kingdom and that the nation, I'll just call them the nation states of the world, also have a master, but they've actually been, when you look at some of the theology, their domain is actually more in line with the devil than with Jesus, and that the kingdoms of the world God has allowed to sort of exist, but they're not under his control and they're not under his blessing. And so this whole idea that, like, the United States of America under is under God's authority and blessing is really controversial to me. And I'll give the scriptural analogy to this that always comes up in these conversations. It's the Romans 13. So another place to look at this is Romans 12 and Romans 13, where God appoints ministers to do good and or Paul is saying to do good and to punish evil. And the huge irony there is that Paul is writing. Do you know which Roman emperor is?
Was this Nero at the time?
Yeah, that's right. And so Paul is writing under Nero, and then Nero goes and cuts Paul's head off. So you gotta, for me, you gotta just think to yourself, like, I don't believe that Rome in that era was a nation under God in the same way that I don't believe that the United States is a nation under God. I do think that the United States has more like Judeo-Christian values embedded in some of its documents and things like that. But this whole idea that God is like appointing the president and that president is like a Christian, and I just think it's really difficult for me to stomach that.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we're kind of at time here for the podcast. So, would you be willing to pray for our listeners as they, process this information and think about how to live with a two kingdom mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we come before you. We're thankful for your teachings, and we're thankful for somehow you sending your son to make his dwelling among us and to show us the way to life. God, we think about Jesus' teachings here on oaths, and God, I pray that you would give us the wisdom to understand it, the wisdom to apply it, and the wisdom to make it relevant in our time. God, please let us not leave some of these important things by the wayside if they're not meant to be forgotten. As we strive to make disciples and follow Christ as King, I pray that his teachings would be front of mind. I pray that this would sort of spark a way to be more faithful over time to anybody who listens. And in Jesus' name I pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Zach.
Absolutely.